Before the video begins, I'd like you all to do me a massive favor. My buddy is making some amazing true crime content on his channel, The Disturbing Truth. The cases he covers are some of the rawest, hardest-hitting true crime horror stories I've ever heard. If that's your kind of thing, please subscribe to The Disturbing Truth by clicking the top link in the description or the link in my pinned comment below. But let me warn you, this content will leave you seriously unsettled. Bring a strong stomach, and let's give The Disturbing Truth some support. The small city of Napa, California is perhaps most well known for its stunning scenery and magnificent vineyards. It's also a remarkably safe and quiet place to live, which is what motivated 26-year-old Lauren Meanza and Adrienne and Sonia to rent an apartment there. They were soon joined by another 26-year-old woman named Leslie Mazzara, and on the night of Halloween 2004, the three girls entertained themselves by handing out candy to the throngs of trick-or-treaters which roamed the streets. By 11 p.m., all three women were tucked into bed, ready to get up bright and early to face the working day ahead. Adrienne and Leslie slept upstairs in their Dorset Street house, while Lauren slept in a converted bedroom on the ground floor. All was quiet, with the spookiest night of the year seeming to have come and gone without incident. But around 2 a.m., that peace was to be shattered, quite literally, when Lauren Meanza woke up to the sound of glass breaking upstairs. She cautiously climbed out of bed, exited her room, and crept toward the staircase to investigate. But Lauren was stopped dead in her tracks when she heard a blood-curdling scream come from one of the upstairs bedrooms. Her instinct was to run upstairs and see what was going on, but after hearing heavy footsteps on the landing above her, she knew something terrible was going on. Whoever was up there, it wasn't Leslie or Adrienne. They were hearing boots, and they were big. Lauren ran back down the stairs and hurtled into the backyard, hiding among some bushes where she sat perfectly still. When she heard the sounds of the same heavy footsteps padding away from the home, she began to summon the courage to walk back inside to survey the damage. When she did so, she could already hear crying coming from one of the upstairs bedrooms and sprinted up the stairs to help. The sight that greeted her was one she would never forget. 26-year-old Leslie was laying face down in a pool of blood, while Adrienne was crouched down behind the bed, alive but gravely wounded. Lauren said there was so much blood that she slipped when she hurried to call 911, and when she finally got to the phone, she found the line had been cut. Rushing to use her cell phone instead, the EMTs that arrived shortly after were tragically unable to save either Leslie or Adrienne. Both girls had been stabbed many, many times. As part of the initial investigation, local law enforcement launched an intensive search of both the house and the surrounding area. They found a number of cigarette butts laying in the dirt outside, but it was discovered that neither Lauren, Leslie, nor Adrienne smoked. They were thus determined to have belonged to the killer, who had evidently smoked them while laying in wait for his prey to let their guard down. But this also led police to believe that he may well have been dressed in a Halloween costume in order to blend in with the hordes of hungry candy hunters. When news of the murders reached Napa's residents, they were stunned. There hadn't been a single murder in the county for 2 whole years, and both the cold calculation of the murders, as well as the outright savagery, had citizens looking over their shoulders in fear. What's more, the lack of a decisive resolution led to a swirl of vicious rumors, some of which blamed the victims themselves for allegedly being involved in the narcotics trade. Another one suggested that Francis Ford Coppola, who owned the winery Leslie Mazzara worked at, was involved with the Italian mafia, and that the ladies were collateral damage. Officials were quick to assert that these rumors had absolutely no basis in truth, and that the official line was that Leslie had been the primary target of the attack. She had been attacked first, with a shocking level of brutality, and evidence suggested that she had been sleeping when she was first stabbed. Following the initial wound, Leslie had awoken before attempting to escape her killer by running into Adrienne's room. Adrienne had then tried to defend her friend, sustaining the fatal stab wound in the process. But the question remained, who would have the motive to commit such a horrendous act of senseless violence? As with most homicides, detectives looked at those closest to the girls as their likeliest source of suspect, and they began to scour the backgrounds of Adrienne and Leslie. Shortly after being hired by the city, Adrienne and Sonia had started dating a man named Christian Lee. Their relationship proved intense but volatile. She wanted a long-term commitment, whereas Christian preferred something casual. But other than this small-time relationship drama, there was very little else of a negative nature occurring in Adrienne's life, and her social circle was relatively small. In contrast to Adrienne, Leslie Mazzara had a much larger circle of friends. The former South Carolina beauty queen had moved to California just a few short months before she was murdered, and was debating pursuing a career either as a teacher or an attorney. Needless to say, she adored California, and what began as a summer job at Francis Ford Coppola's winery turned into an all-consuming passion. She proved to be a popular girl among her coworkers, and Leslie was also popular with the opposite sex, and friends noted that she dated around during her first few months in Napa. In fact, when two of her South Carolina friends visited her out in Napa, she told them she was dating 2 men at the same time, one older and one younger. Then, in an incident which left them distinctly shaken, the older man stopped by at Leslie's apartment and was furious to find flowers sent by the younger of the 2 men. According to her friends, Leslie was a heartbreaker, but it was purely unintentional. She was a kind-hearted young woman who had a way of making everyone feel as if though they were her best friend. Police then began to examine Leslie's computer, and upon doing so, discovered an email from an ex-boyfriend. The two had broken up years earlier after he proposed and she turned him down, but he reached out to her not long before her murder. But Leslie was also in communication with a number of other men, some of which had treated her to some rather expensive gifts, including a Caribbean cruise and a brand new car. Another of her hometown friends remembered her joining them for a wedding ceremony back in South Carolina, where she toted a set of luxury luggage, all apparently purchased for her by yet another of her admirers. This friend would later claim that on the same night she was killed, the father of one of Leslie's spurned loves had repeatedly tried to get in contact with her, but had not been able to do so. This led police to believe that she may well have dated someone who had become so dangerously obsessed with her that he had resorted to the unthinkable. If I can't have her, no one will. This was supported by the fact that the killer chose to gain access to Leslie's room via her window, eschewing all other potential points of entry. In the course of their investigation, police officers interviewed over 1,500 different people. One of these interviewees was Christian Lee, one of Leslie's on-and-off-again boyfriends. Several other of her admirers were questioned, but the investigation failed to progress. The lack of arrests understandably frustrated the victims' families and friends, who felt they had to defend their daughters' reputations in order to keep the investigation going. But as time passed, the hope of those closest to the victim began to fade. Some, such as Adrienne's best friend Lily Prudhomme, were heavily affected by her death. It made them realize that life was fragile and has to be enjoyed while it lasted. She soon made arrangements to wed her long-term boyfriend, a young man named Eric Koppel. One of Adrienne's parents attended the wedding, where the Maroon 5 song "She Will Be Loved" was played in honor of their much-missed daughter. It was a bittersweet moment for all involved, with both Lily and Eric expressing their sorrow at the loss of Adrienne. Then almost a year later, in September of 2005, detectives from the Napa City Police's Homicide Department were still working on the case when they received a pair of unexpected visitors. It was Lily Prudhomme, now Lily Koppel, and accompanying her was her husband Eric. Eric was somber-faced, while his wife seemed distraught, and after asking to speak to the detectives working their deceased friend's case, Lily Koppel looked to her husband with a look of hatred in her eyes and spoke, "Go ahead. Tell him what you did." The detective who took down Eric Koppel's confession was stunned at the revelation, an emotion shared by all who learned of the scandalous turn of events. There was no question of his guilt, as Eric's DNA had been found both on the cigarette butts that were found outside the home, as well in the blood samples that had been obtained from the broken window. The only real question that remained was why. In January of 2007, before he was sentenced to life in prison, Eric Koppel was allowed to read out a statement. He apologized to the Insonia and Mazzara families, weeping as he did so. But then, to the utter confusion of all in attendance, he claimed the murder wasn't in the least bit personal, instead blaming his bloodlust on the death of his grandfather. Lily confirmed that Eric's depression was to blame for his behavior, and despite her claim that nothing he could do could lessen her love for him, she did later file for divorce. But why did Eric really kill Adrienne? Was depression really to blame? Or was there some other considerably more sinister motive at work? The actual date of Leslie and Adrienne's murder, November 1st, has a huge degree of significance to it. Remember when we touched on Adrienne's death motivating Lily to finally tie the knot with Eric? Well, they'd actually planned to get married the previous year, and the date they had chosen was November 1st. But Lily had backed out of the wedding, telling Eric that she and Adrienne would discuss the possibility of their marriage before she made a definitive decision. This might have given Eric the idea that Adrienne was behind Lily calling the wedding off in the first place, enraging him to the point of deciding to kill her. It could have also been some kind of passive-aggressive attempt to push his fiancée. If he couldn't kill her, he'd kill her best friend. Both Lily and Eric would later go on to appear in the television crime program 48 Hours. In the episode, Lily talks about how someone must have noticed someone in their life acting strangely, and how if the killer was hiding in their midst, they wouldn't be able to hide forever. She also stated that whoever was close to them must have an idea of their guilt, and were just as guilty as the murderer if they failed to come forward. All the while, her murderous husband is sitting next to her, seemingly unfazed by the gravity of his wife's words. This raises the question, did Lily know? Was she actually aware that her husband had killed her friend as some kind of punishment, and was so terrified of him that she opted to cover his tracks? It's impossible to tell, and until Lily Koppel confirms such a theory, it remains pure conjecture in the eyes of the law. Lauren Mayanza, the roommate who survived the brutal night, left Napa and relocated to Los Angeles. She later told members of the press that she had been traumatized by the events of that Halloween night, to the extent that she actually felt more comfortable in a relatively violent city like Los Angeles, that she felt more at home there considering the things she was haunted with. Eric Koppel remains behind bars, where he is serving 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. Yet his internal segregation from civilized society is of little comfort to those left behind, for there will be many, many more like Eric, undetectable, silent evil, that we'll never be aware of until it's far, far too late. Born in Nagoya, Japan, on November 22nd of 1975, Yoshihiro Hattori was the second child of Masaichi and Mieko Hattori. In August of 1992, when Yoshihiro was just 16 years old, he traveled all the way to Baton Rouge, Louisiana as part of the American Field Services Student Exchange Program. There he was hosted by the Haymaker family, consisting of parents Richard, Holly, and Webb, their teenage son. It was a trip that was supposed to enrich Yoshihiro's life for the better. With his English language skills vastly improved by his stay in Louisiana, he could return to Japan as a highly sought-after business asset, a status which promised a long and successful career in the field of his choosing. But in reality, it was a trip that Yoshihiro would never return from. In early October of 1992, Yoshihiro and Webb Haymaker received an invitation to a Halloween party that had been organized for the Japanese exchange students of Louisiana State University. Set for the night of October 17th, Yoshihiro's choice of costume was a white tuxedo and a slicked-back disco hairstyle, both of which made him look uncannily like John Travolta's character from the movie Saturday Night Fever. Then at around 8 p.m., Yoshihiro and Webb drove over to the party which was being held at East Baton Rouge. However, when they arrived at the street in question, they became confused over which house they were looking for. The two young men walked up the driveway of one particularly decorated house, believing it to be the site of the party, when in fact, it was the home of Rodney and Bonnie Paris. When Webb and Yoshihiro rang the home's doorbell, Rodney and Bonnie became nervous. They weren't expecting anyone, and no one had called ahead to let them know they'd be dropping by. So instead of going directly to the front door, Bonnie Paris went instead to the home's side entrance and peered around a corner to see who was ringing the bell. There stood Webb and Yoshihiro, Yoshi in his tux, while Webb wore a neck brace and bandages with fake blood staining them, evidently some kind of accident victim. They were quite obviously in costumes befitting the occasion, but when she called out to the boys, they approached her, and Bonnie panicked. She ran back inside, slammed the door, and screamed out to her husband, "Rodney, get your gun." Rodney Paris, a 30-year-old butcher, heard his wife's terrified cry and simply reacted, running to fetch a .44 Magnum revolver from another room. Outside, Webb and Yoshihiro must have realized that they rang at the wrong house and began to walk back down the driveway towards their car. That's when Rodney Paris burst from his home, aiming the revolver at them and commanding them to freeze. The boys were terrified, and Webb began to beg Rodney not to shoot them, explaining that they were looking for a party and had simply rang at the wrong house. Yoshihiro, on the other hand, didn't seem to understand what was going on, and for some reason reached into his pocket to produce a camera. It may well have been simply to show Rodney that the pair meant no harm, but it also is very possible that Yoshihiro believed that the whole thing was nothing but a Halloween prank. You see, the .44 that Rodney was pointing at him included a laser sight, something that was still very much a novelty back in 1992. Therefore, it stands to reason that as someone who wasn't well acquainted with the use of firearms, Yoshi might have believed the very real handgun to be nothing more than a sci-fi prop, a prop that Yoshi might have wanted to take a photograph of. Either way, Rodney caught sight of the camera in his hand, mistook it for a firearm, and fired a shot into Yoshi's chest from a distance of just 5 feet away. Yoshihiro fell, gasping for air, while Rodney Paris ran back into his house for cover. Webb, horrified by what he just witnessed, sprinted over to a neighboring house to fetch help, but when this neighbor returned, saw Yoshihiro, and begged the Paris family to call 911, Bonnie Paris told them, "Go away." It took far longer than it should have to summon medical aid, and by the time EMTs appeared on scene, Yoshihiro was already on death's door. The single shot had torn through both upper and lower lobes of his left lung, resulting in a huge exit wound to the rear of his ribcage. That wound was so catastrophic that within just a few short minutes of being in the ambulance, Yoshihiro passed away from blood loss. Shockingly, the Baton Rouge Police Department actually released Rodney Paris shortly after following his arrest, declining to charge him on the grounds that Yoshihiro was trespassing. The decision caused worldwide outrage, prompting the intervention of both Louisiana Governor Edwin Tuttle as well as the Japanese Consul General. Only then was Rodney rearrested and charged with manslaughter. He attempted to defend his actions by claiming that Yoshihiro had an extremely unusual manner of moving, adding that anyone would have found the experience to be a frightening one. But Yoshihiro wasn't dressed like some monster or demon. He wasn't covered in blood-soaked rags like his companion, Webb. He was wearing a poorly fitted off-white tuxedo. He looked objectively comical, not in the least bit threatening. At his trial for manslaughter, Rodney Paris was painted as an average Joe, or as his defense attorney colorfully phrased it, he was a man who likes sugar in his grits. A person who was coming at me from behind the car. They were moving real fast, he told the courtroom. I pointed my gun and hollered at them to freeze, but they just kept coming. Again, I told them to stop, but they kept moving, laughing while they walked. I was scared to death, I had no choice. I'm just sorry that any of this ever happened. Yet the prosecution was quick to establish that at 6'2", Rodney towered over the 130-pound Yoshi, and that he was armed with one of the most powerful handguns on the market. Yoshi had nothing in his hands but a small disposable camera. What's more, the two teens had actually announced themselves upon arrival, as both Rodney and Bonnie testified that they were only aware that someone was outside because they'd rang the doorbell. They weren't sneaking around the property, probing for an entry point. All they'd done was call at the wrong house. The police officer who first arrested Rodney on the night of the murder then took the stand, telling the jury that while in the back of his patrol car, Rodney had told him, "Boy, I messed up, huh? I made a real bad mistake back there." Rodney knew what he did was wrong, and that he'd grossly overreacted, or more accurately, that he'd acted negligently on the overreaction of his wife, Bonnie. This was pretty much what his defense attorney's entire argument hinged on, the idea that Rodney Paris was simply defending the woman he loved. "He was coming real fast towards me," Bonnie Paris said when she later took the stand. "I never had anybody come at me like that before in my life. I was terrified. There was no thinking involved. I wish I could have thought. If only I just stopped to think." It seemed like an open and shut case. A skittish couple had hideously overreacted to nothing more than an honest mistake, and a teenage boy had lost his life as a result. But just after a week after the trial began, the world was once again horrified when the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, after deliberating for just 3 hours. A courtroom full of spectators burst into spontaneous applause when they heard the news. Yet thankfully, Rodney didn't get away completely scot-free. Following a civil suit filed by the Hattori family, the Supreme Court of Louisiana ordered Rodney to pay over $500,000 in damages to Yoshiro's grieving relatives. As of 2013, it was reported that Rodney was divorced, broke, and living in a Louisiana trailer park. He may have escaped justice, but he clearly can't escape the legacy or the memory of what he did that chill October night. Rodney Paris is a man plagued by the closest thing to an actual real-life ghost, a sense of crippling, haunting, and unshakable guilt. On October 31st of 1979, 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford was making her way home from a Halloween party in the Sunland Tahunga neighborhood of the San Fernando Valley. Having been unable to get a ride home from the party, Shirley found herself having to hitchhike and was standing outside a gas station when she suddenly recognized someone who drove up to the pumps. His name was Lawrence, and Shirley knew him through his frequent visits to a restaurant where she worked as a part-time waitress. As Lawrence got out of his van to pump gas, Shirley approached them, asking if he might be able to give her a ride home. He accepted, but when she opened the van's sliding door and climbed into the cavernous interior, she found she was not alone. Lawrence was in the company of a friend named Roy. As Lawrence drove Shirley home, Roy offered Shirley some cannabis to smoke. She refused, knowing she was going to be back in the presence of her parents at any moment. But as the van continued to drive for longer than the journey required, Shirley began to wonder what route they were taking. Lawrence assured her that he was just avoiding heavy traffic, but when he stopped the van and announced that they'd arrived at their destination, Shirley didn't recognize the street outside the van. She turned to Roy, intending to ask where they'd taken her, only to see he produced a knife. He told her if she screamed, she was dead. Shirley looked to Lawrence. She knew him. He'd been kind to her. Surely he'd have the humanity to stop whatever Roy was threatening to do. But when she saw that he was a part of it, out she'd walked right into a trap of his creating. We can only imagine the kind of horror she felt. Shirley was bound and gagged with construction tape, and Lawrence sat in the rear of the van with her as Roy drove them up to the San Gabriel Mountains. With the roar of traffic masking any noise, Lawrence removed the construction tape gag from Shirley's mouth before he began to torment her. He beat her, slapped her, and mocked her mercilessly, demanding that she say something. Shirley had no idea what he wanted her to say, and it's clear that what Lawrence wanted was to hear her beg. He wanted her to express the terror and the helplessness she felt. He wanted to soak up the agony of her torment. And when she failed to find the words, he found screams to be just as satisfying. He began torturing her with a claw hammer and a pair of pliers, smashing her elbows, twisting at chunks of her flesh until blood flowed. When Shirley began to scream, Lawrence simply told her to scream louder, knowing all would be drowned out by the sound of the traffic outside. It was later discovered that Lawrence had smashed the flat side of the claw hammer into Shirley's elbow 25 times, and when it was completely shattered, she cried out in agony, and he asked her, "What are you sniveling about?" When Lawrence grew bored of torturing Shirley, he placed a wire coat hanger around her neck, which he then tightened with his pliers. By this time, Shirley was said to be almost catatonic and barely reacted as the coat hanger grew tighter and tighter around her throat. The 16-year-old died with her eyes open that Halloween night, and as her body began to grow cold, Lawrence and Roy had to decide what to do with her. It was then that Lawrence had the idea to dump Shirley's body on the front lawn of a random family home, the goal being to generate as much media attention as possible. Roy agreed, and the pair drove to a house in Sunland where the men dragged Shirley's lifeless body from the van before tossing her into a bed of ivy. Roy Norris was the first to be arrested, albeit on a different charge. Yet the arresting police noticed how terrified he appeared to be while in their custody. All it took was being confronted with some small piece of evidence from a minor crime he committed 2 months previously, and Roy completely caved. Although it was clear that Lawrence was the driving force behind the murders, he admitted that they were both in the habit of driving around the Pacific Coast Highway while hunting for girls to abduct. Shirley Ledford, the only body the police had found by that time, was their 5th and final victim. The 2 men had been killing young women all summer long. Inside the van, the girls would typically be beaten, tied up, then driven to locations deep within the San Gabriel Mountains. There, both Roy and Lawrence would take turns torturing and carnally assaulting their victim before their eventual execution by strangulation. During a search of Lawrence's motel home following his arrest, the police found several bottles of highly acidic liquid that was intended for use on their next victim. When asked why they sought out such creative methods of inflicting pain, Lawrence reportedly said, "Because it's fun." Police also found hundreds of Polaroid photographs in Lawrence's apartment, many detailing his grisly crimes, but others were of seemingly random girls taken when they were unaware, and it became clear that these were all potential victims, spotted and documented while they were on the hunt for fresh victims. Thankfully, around 60 of these women and girls were tracked down, and it was found that no harm had come to them. At Lawrence's trial for kidnap and murder, the most haunting and damning piece of evidence presented was the 17-minute clip of an audio tape he'd created, the one which detailed the brutal torture of Shirley Ledford. When it was presented to the jury on January 29th of 1981, prosecutor Stephen Kay warned the jury, "For those of you who don't know what it's like, you're about to find out." Just over 100 people were in the courtroom when it was played, and a huge number of those present openly wept upon hearing it. Some even ran from the courtroom when the screams grew too intense, unable to listen to poor Shirley's screams any longer. Lawrence, on the other hand, smiled when he saw the reaction of the jury. Even a hardened prosecutor like Kay had to walk out at one point, later telling reporters that everybody who has heard that tape has had it affect their lives. "I just picture those girls, how alone they were when they died." Some question if the tape should have been played in court at all, and Lawrence's defense attorney had previously tried to get it banned. But when posed the question, Kay emphatically stated that, "You're darn right it should have been played. The jury needs to know what those guys did." Yet when confronted with the depravity and suffering on the tapes, Lawrence claimed it was real funny. At the conclusion of the trial, with Roy Norris already having confessed to his crimes, Lawrence Bittaker attempted to defend himself. He not only claimed that the interaction with Shirley Ledford was entirely consensual, but also that she hadn't been tortured or killed in his presence. He claimed the last he saw of her was when Roy drove her into the San Gabriel Mountains, which was apparently on her route home. When confronted with the contents of the audio recording, Lawrence claimed it was evidence of nothing more than a particularly boisterous ménage à trois, but the jury saw through his sadistic lies and found him guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 5 charges of kidnapping, 9 charges of carnal assault, 2 charges of forcible oral copulation, 1 charge of sodomy, and 3 charges of unlawful possession of a firearm. This proceeded to a judge sentencing Lawrence to death, whereas Roy would be up for parole after serving 30 years of a 45-year sentence. It was the rap sheet of a monster, a creature who saw decent human beings as nothing more than just playthings. But the question remained, how did such a vicious predator come to exist in the first place? Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September 27th of 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the accidental child of a couple who'd planned not to have children. Shortly after his birth, Lawrence's biological mother gave him up to an orphanage, where he was subsequently adopted by a Mr. and Mrs. George Bittaker. George worked in the aviation industry, an occupation which required frequent relocations around the United States. Fully aware of his adopted status, the transient lifestyle further compounded Lawrence's psychological issues, and by age 12, he had already been convicted of minor larceny in a juvenile court. According to Lawrence, his bad behavior was an attempt to gain more attention from his adopted parents, who he felt starved him for affection. Following a high school aptitude test, Lawrence was found to have an IQ of 138, meaning he was deemed to have an above-average intelligence. But on the whole, he found his education to be tedious and dropped out of high school at 16. At this point in his life, he and his adoptive parents had moved out to California, where Lawrence added a number of other crimes to his rap sheet, including car theft, a hit and run, and 1 incident of evading arrest. He spent around a year inside as a result of these crimes, but when he was released from the custody of the California Youth Authority, he found his adopted parents had moved out of state without informing him. They had essentially disowned him, and Lawrence would never see either of them again. The abandonment seemed to have occurred at a kind of philosophical crossroad in Lawrence's life. There was a slim chance that, following his release, he could have been rehabilitated with the help of his adoptive parents' love. But upon being abandoned, Lawrence dove headfirst into a life of increasingly serious crimes. Within just a few days of his parole from the California Youth Authority, Bittaker was arrested for automobile crimes and spent the next several years in and out of prison. While locked up on robbery charges, a prison psychiatrist was the first to label Lawrence as having highly manipulative tendencies, as well as having considerable concealed hostility. A few years later, Bittaker underwent further examination by 2 independent psychiatrists, both of whom classified him as a borderline psychopath, a highly manipulative individual unable to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. According to them, Bittaker explained to one of them that his crimes gave him an inflated sense of self-importance, adding that his rough upbringing increased his compulsion to break the law. Bittaker was prescribed antipsychotic medication, but just a short while after his release, an LA supermarket employee had observed Bittaker stealing a steak and followed Bittaker outside and into the store's parking lot. The clerk confronted Lawrence and asked whether he had forgotten to pay. Bittaker responded by stabbing the young man in the chest, with the blade only narrowly missing his heart. Gary Louis survived the stabbing, and Lawrence was incarcerated at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. It's there that he met the man with whom he would later terrorize the young women of Southern California, Roy Lewis Norris. Born in February of 1948 to a poor father and drug-addicted mother, Roy was repeatedly placed in the care of foster families throughout his home state of Colorado. One of the most prevalent memories of his childhood were incessant false accusation of misbehavior. He was punished when he was guilty, punished when he was innocent, and was often deprived of food or clothing as a result. This twisted variety of discipline taught Roy that it didn't matter if he was good or bad, so he might as well act in his own self-interest, consequences be damned. At age 16, Roy apparently visited the home of a female relative who was just a few years older than him and began talking to her in an aggressive, carnally suggestive manner. When her father chased him from the house, Roy stole his car, drove it up into the Rocky Mountains, and attempted to take his own life by injecting an air bubble into his artery in his arm. He survived the attempt and was later apprehended as a runaway, yet on his return home, Roy's parents told him that he and his little sister were both unwanted children and that they intended to divorce when they reached their teenage years. The psychological impact of this is immeasurably destructive and possibly contributed to Roy's decision to later join the U.S. Navy. He would see 4 short months of service in Vietnam, but saw no combat and was discharged following his return home. Yet shortly after his return from Vietnam, Roy was arrested for his first known carnal offense, one of which included an attempt to force his way into the car of a lone woman. Norris was then diagnosed by military psychologists as having a severe schizoid personality and was given an administrative discharge due to his psychological problems. It didn't take long for him to strike again because, in May of 1970, Roy began stalking a young woman on the San Diego State University campus. One night, after catching her walking home alone, he hit her over the back of the head with a rock to subdue her. Then, after kneeling on the woman's lower back, he repeatedly beat her head against the sidewalk, causing life-threatening cranial injuries. Roy was sent to prison for the assault, but somehow, after just 5 years inside, prison doctors declared him no further danger to others, and he was released from the Atascadero State Hospital in 1975. It took just 3 months for him to offend again, attacking a 27-year-old woman after offering her a ride on his motorcycle. When she declined, Roy grabbed the woman's scarf, twisting it around her neck, before dragging her into some nearby bushes. Fearing for her life, the woman did not resist and later reported Roy to the police. He was arrested, convicted, then ordered to serve out his sentence at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, which, as we know, is where he met Lawrence Bittaker. By the time Lawrence arrived in prison, Roy was already associated with a group of hardened criminals from a series of one-percenter motorcycle gangs. Roy later testified that Lawrence had intervened on 2 separate occasions when fellow prisoners had been intending to harm him. This led to the pair becoming fast friends, and after discovering they both held misogynistic views, as well as a mutual interest in carnal violence, they began to plan out their eventual murder spree. The peak of their depraved fantasies involved an elaborate plan to murder one girl of each teenage year from 13 through 19, and after becoming fixated on such a scheme, the pair agreed to put their plan into action following their mutual release from prison. Following his conviction, Lawrence Bittaker granted several interviews from his cell on California's death row. In one of them, he stated that the only remorse he felt was that he'd been caught, and sometimes signed off replies to fan mail with the name Pliers Bittaker. He also seemed to enjoy how close he and Roy were, despite having very little in common. "We got a heck of a lot in common now," he told one reporter, laughing as he spoke. In the end, Lawrence Bittaker would die of natural causes on December 13, 2019, aged 79. Roy Norris also died in prison, passing away at the age of 72 in February of 2020. He too gave several interviews while imprisoned and repeatedly made the claim that Lawrence forced him into participating in the murders. He also claimed to have contemplated reporting their activities to the police, and also that he'd actively worked to dissuade victims from entering the van the pair nicknamed the Murder Mac. "I didn't enjoy killing," he said, "but that was Lawrence's favorite part, watching the women struggle to live, knowing he'd soon be taking life away." Yet despite his attempts to defer responsibility, legions of investigators and psychologists have asserted that Roy derived extreme gratification from the domination, abuse, and torture of his victims, and insisted he was just as culpable as Lawrence was. Stephen Kay, the prosecutor at Lawrence's trial, still considers what the media refer to as the toolbox murders to be the most disturbing criminal case he'd ever handled. He publicly stated that Lawrence Bittaker was more deserving of being executed than any other inmate on California's death row, and that even 2 years after the trial, he was haunted by reoccurring nightmares in which he would be rushing to Bittaker's van to prevent harm coming to the girls, but would always get there too late. Paul Bynum, the case's chief investigator, took his own life in December of 1987. In his note, Bynum specifically referred to the murders committed by Bittaker and Norris as haunting him, and of his fear that they might hunt him down after being released from prison. The audio cassette detailing the torture of Shirley Ledford remains in the possession of the FBI Academy and is used to train and desensitize FBI agents to the raw reality of torture and murder. When the courtroom heard those very same tapes, the horror they produced affirmed the Toolbox murders as some of the most sickeningly disturbing in American history. And what's clear is that Lawrence Bittaker knew what he was doing when he chose Halloween as a night to hunt innocent young women. He knew the date would compound their terror and exacerbate their misery, so much so that he brought along a tape recorder to remember it by. On the night before Halloween of 1975, 15-year-old Martha Moxley joined a group of friends to participate in what's known affectionately as Mischief Night. Mischief Night, sometimes known as Devil's Night, is an informal holiday on which children and teenagers engage in pranks and vandalism. In particular, Martha and her friends focused on Ding Dong Ditch, knocking on doors and ringing doorbells before running away, and what's known as TPing, when rolls of toilet paper are hurled over trees or houses so that long trails of paper are formed. According to her friends, on the night in question, Martha had been flirting with an older boy named Thomas Skakel, and the two had been witnessed sharing kisses before falling behind a fence together. Martha's friends left her in the company of Thomas at around 9:30 p.m., knowing better than to try and separate the young couple. Little did they know, it would be the last time they'd see Martha alive. The following morning, Martha's mother walked out into the large communal backyard at the rear of her home after spotting something lying under a tree. When she approached, she let out a blood-curdling scream. It wasn't some elaborate Halloween decoration. It was the lifeless corpse of her own daughter, Martha, and she had been bludgeoned to the point of being almost unrecognizable. Her pants and underwear had been pulled down, and pieces of broken golf club were lying near her body. There was also evidence that once the golf club had broken, her killer had begun to stab her with the sharp end of the broken club. It took a lot of work, but police eventually traced the sale of the golf club to none other than the Skakel family, whose son, Thomas, had been cavorting with Martha just the night before. Given that he was the last person to see her alive, Thomas Skakel became the case's #1 suspect. Yet police discovered that Thomas's father had forbidden access to his school and mental health records. It was also around then that police announced a second suspect in the case, that of Kenneth Littleton, who had started working as a live-in tutor for the Skakel family only hours before the murder. Over the years, Thomas Skakel significantly changed his alibi for the night of Moxley's murder. However, his younger brother Michael made a shocking confession when he claimed that he had been window peeping and touching himself in a tree beside the Moxley property from 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. On top of that, two children who knew Michael from his time in a treatment center for troubled youths testified they heard Michael confess to killing Martha with a golf club. One of these children, Gregory Coleman, testified that Michael was given special privileges and had bragged, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." And it was true. Michael's aunt Ethel was the widow of U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and what's more, his grandfather George was the founder of Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, one of the largest and wealthiest privately held corporations in the United States. And just as Michael predicted, no one was charged, and the case remained cold for decades. 16 years later, in 1991, when a man named William Kennedy Smith was acquitted of carnal assault, a rumor was spread that he was present at the Skakel house on the night of Martha's murder. It was also implied that the much younger William had either been involved with the murder or at least knew the identity of the responsible party. In the end, these rumors were proven to be completely baseless, but the intense media speculation resulted in Martha's case being reopened, with Michael's uncle rushed in hiring the Sutton Associates private detective agency to conduct their own investigation of the murder. The investigation was inconclusive, but what came to be known as the Sutton Report was eventually leaked to the media, and it revealed that both Thomas and Michael had radically changed their stories since the initial investigation, thus imparting a great deal of suspicion on each of them. This led to numerous Greenwich police detectives becoming convinced that Thomas was the killer. It took 7 long years after the case was reopened, but in June of 1998, it was decided that there was enough evidence to formally charge Michael Skakel with murder. Shockingly, despite Michael supposedly having committed the crime when he was just 15 years old, a judge ruled in January of 2001 that Michael would be tried as an adult, setting his bail at $500,000. The trial began on May 7, 2002, with Michael Skakel insisting he was at his cousin's house at the time of the murder. However, the prosecution was quick to point out that the same tree Michael had been touching himself behind on the night of the murder was the very same tree under which Martha's body was found. This was the prosecution's central argument, that Michael had been watching his older brother kissing Martha and had approached her for similar affections once she was alone. When she refused, he'd run into the house, grabbed a golf club, then beat Martha to death in revenge for rejecting him. The argument was apparently a strong one, and on June 7th of 2002, Thomas Skakel was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in the Garner Correctional Institution in Newtown, Connecticut. But Thomas had always insisted on his innocence, and in 2007, his attorneys filed for a new trial based on a theory involving Gitano Tony Bryant, cousin of Los Angeles Lakers player Kobe Bryant and a former classmate of Skakel at the private Brunswick School in Greenwich. Bryant said that on the night of Moxley's murder, one of his friends had wanted to attack Martha, but he had been advised not to come forward as the case had already been solved. It took until December of 2016 for the Connecticut Supreme Court to uphold Michael Skakel's murder conviction with a 4-3 majority decision, adding that the conviction was the result of overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors, and that his legal representation had not been incompetent, as he'd attempted to assert. The very same year, Skakel's cousin Robert Kennedy Jr. released a book entitled Framed. In it, he insisted that his cousin had been set up by the authorities, and that an innocent man had now been languishing in prison for almost 2 decades. It seems ironic that Michael believed he would get away with the murder due to his family connections, when in reality, even those high-profile relatives would be totally unable to help him escape justice. Halloween night of 1982 started out just like any other for Marvin and Ethel Brandlin. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but one that came alive with young trick-or-treaters every time Halloween came around. Marvin and Ethel loved seeing the effort all the kids put into their costumes and handsomely rewarded any that arrived on their doorstep with fistfuls of miniature candies. As the evening went on, the frequency at which trick-or-treaters called at their door began to dwindle, and by around 10 p.m., the Brandlins believed they'd be undisturbed for the remainder of the night. However, when their doorbell rang out one last time and Marvin went to answer it, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. On the doorstep stood a young man wearing a pillowcase for a mask, and when Marvin suddenly found a gun being pointed in his face, he realized it was no trick-or-treater. According to Ethel, the young man wanted money, but it was by no mere happenstance that he'd ended up on their doorstep. because when Marvin Brandlin laughed and claimed all his cash was in the bank, the boy with the pillowcase for a mask knew he was lying. We can only imagine how haunting it must have been for Marvin, knowing this person had somehow gained inside knowledge of his home's finances, and in his desperation, he made a grab for the boy's pistol. But the robber was fast, pulling the trigger before Marvin could disarm him and sending a bullet tearing through the homeowner's throat. Knowing the robbery had gone horribly wrong, the robber pulled off the pillowcase and fled the scene. Ethel ran to her husband's aid, but not only was she unable to save him, she was too late to catch a glimpse of his killer's face. Police pinned their hopes on pulling a DNA sample from the mask, but that line of inquiry proved inconclusive, and with it, the case went cold. But what's objectively terrifying about the murder is that the killer might well be in the Brandlins' social circle, and is possible even a not-so-distant nephew or grandson. As of 2010, the case was reopened, but to this day, there's not a single suspect or arrest pertaining to Marvin Brandlin's murder. And as we stated, the killer could have been hiding in plain sight all this time. So, be careful who you answer your door to this Halloween, because lurking among those innocent trick-or-treaters could be some very dangerous people. On Halloween night of 1998, an African-American man in his early 20s by the name of Carl Jackson was driving his girlfriend and her young son home through the New York City borough of the Bronx, when suddenly, an egg slammed into his car windshield. Egging, a popular but degenerate Halloween tradition in which innocent, unsuspecting people are pelted with raw eggs. Most of the time, the intention is fairly innocent, and the result is nothing but some mild humiliation. But sometimes, childish pranks can lead to frighteningly volatile consequences. Naturally, Carl was feeling rather protective of his girlfriend and her infant son. So when he spotted the egg throwers laughing on the nearby sidewalk, he stopped his car, got out, and began to approach them, castigating them for potentially causing a severe traffic accident. Most of the teenagers took the dressing down in their stride, as Carl called them out for being immature deadbeats who needed to be taught some respect. He didn't lay hands on the teenagers, he knew better than that, instead using some creative but colorful language to shame them for their actions. But one of them was unable to handle such skewering criticism, and as Carl Jackson climbed back into the driver's seat of his car and drove off, 17-year-old Curtis Sterling climbed into his own vehicle and began a stealthy pursuit. Sterling waited until Carl and his girlfriend had arrived at their destination and had gotten out of their parked car. Then, no sooner had he climbed out of the driver's seat, Carl was greeted with the sight of an angry 17-year-old pointing a gun in his face. It would be the last thing he'd ever see. Carl tried to talk, but Sterling wouldn't let him, pulling the trigger and sending a bullet punching through the young man's skull. Carl was dead before he hit the pavement. He had turned 21 years old just 3 weeks before he was killed, and his mother, Gloria, described him as a quiet young man who was just starting a promising career as a data entry clerk for the company Morgan Stanley. I think it took us 2 years to even talk about it, 62-year-old Gloria Jackson later said. We were just devastated. We never thought that anyone from our family would be murdered, especially on a holiday for something so stupid. Curtis Sterling was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the killing, and on every single Halloween that followed his incarceration, Gloria Jackson sent him a greetings card. Time after time, year after year, they said the same old message. I'm glad you're still here. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, oh no, our table, it's broken.